44 nations gathered in 1944 to agree on an international reserve currency. It would be later called the Bretton Woods Program, named after the location in which the meeting was held, and the currency they would decide upon was the US dollar. The US dollar would be used in international trade. Other countries' currencies would be dependent upon the value of the dollar, and the US dollar would be backed up by gold. This is where we get the term the gold standard, as it used to be before the 70s. And we'll get there in a moment. And the most important part was that other countries could exchange their dollars for gold at a rate of $35 per ounce of gold through the US government. This is a net positive for the US, but not indefinitely. The US was the economic powerhouse after World War II. However, with the rise of Western Germany and other rebuilding nations afterwards, the US came under threat of economic challenge, and between 1950 and 1969, the US overall economic output into the world dropped from 35% to 27%. Furthermore, the gold standard caused other issues because the US, effectively acting as a bank for the world, was required to keep reserve currency within its borders.
Foreign holdings of US dollars amounted to 14 billion. Domestic holdings amounted to 10 billion. That comes out to $24 billion in total debt. The US government, however, only had 13.2 billion in its reserves. This would of course be a major issue if too many nations opted to cash out at once, potentially leaving America $10.8 billion in the hole and flat broke.
Countries like Germany wanted to pull out because they refused to revalue their currency. So Germany pulls out, the United States economy dips a little bit. By 7.5%, the dollar decreases against the German mark. Meanwhile, the German economy gets a little bit of boost from pulling out of this. Those issues combined with inflation, war debt, prolific spending, all caused Richard Nixon to think of a way to revise the gold standard Bretton Woods program. In 1971, he ordered the Secretary of the Treasury to halt the convertibility of US dollars into gold so that other nations could not cash out all at once and take all of our money reserves. Similar to how a rumor of stocks dropping could cause a stock crash, the meeting was held in secret at Camp David before Richard Nixon made this announcement so that other nations wouldn't catch wind of it and pull all of the gold out of the country all at once, leaving us broke. Nixon then imposed a 90-day wage and price freeze to halt any possible inflation that we could be seeing in the country. This was the first wage and price control that we had seen in the US since World War II. Furthermore, Nixon placed a 10% import tax on other goods and services coming in from other countries so that they couldn't make money off of us as our currency dropped by selling us their high-priced goods in their currency. Initially, the public liked it. They felt that the government was rescuing them from foreign price gougers and a possible economic collapse or the manipulation of currency by other governments. The Dow rose 33 points the next day, which at the time was the highest that it had ever risen in a 24-hour period. In the long term, however, the US would suffer. The dollar plunged by a third in the 70s. It greatly depreciated against foreign currencies, and it solidified the predominance of free-floating fiat currency on the global stage. This is where we see the entrance of what's called the petrodollar. The petrodollar is a notional unit of currency earned by a country from the export of oil. So then the US struck a deal with Saudi Arabia. What they agreed to do is to standardize oil prices in the US dollar, which means that if China or Russia or Japan or Germany or anyone else wanted to buy oil from Saudi Arabia, and Saudi Arabia eventually convinced the other OPEC states to do the same thing. So if they wanted to buy oil from them, they had to do so with the US dollar, which means that they had to go buy the US dollar and then give it to Saudi Arabia in return for the oil. This again causes the United States to become a de facto reserve currency. Now this causes a couple different issues. On one hand, it's good because the US dollar is in high demand. But also, the US must balance domestic issues such as unemployment, and among other things, with the international interests of the global finance community. This can be a severe threat to national sovereignty because, like I said, banking interests, multinationals, their interests become placed higher than the average American's interest. You can't simultaneously balance a low unemployment rate and domestic economic growth with the international finance interests of the world. It also leads to a thing called petrodollar recycling. This effectively acts as a discount on oil for the United States because we pay Saudi Arabia, for example, in dollars for the oil. Other nations pay Saudi Arabia in dollars for the oil, which means we get oil. And then what is Saudi Arabia going to do with their dollars? Well, it's much easier just for them to spend it in the US. So they will either buy US goods or they'll buy American bonds in the government. And they don't just have dollars coming in from us to do that, they have them coming in from every nation that wants to do so. So we receive a nice little sum of money based on the money that the OPEC nations receive on oil sales. So our oil purchases from Saudi Arabia are effectively subsidized by the oil purchases of the rest of the world. So what if China's yuan takes the place of the dollar as the international reserve currency? Well, the first thing that would happen is the dollar would depreciate. It's no longer in as high of a demand as it was before. Less people need it. What they're talking about right now in China is the Petro yuan, which would be oil sales being conducted, priced in denominations of the yuan rather than the dollar. So that would threaten the United States hegemony in the economic world because it would not be the reserve currency anymore, the de facto reserve currency. So it would be devalued because of that, which on one hand could boost our exports because now our goods are cheaper to the rest of the world, but we can still make money off of them. It can lower our trade deficits with the rest of the world. This is why China is able to flood other countries' markets with a lot of cheap goods. It's because since they're not the reserve currency currently, they're able to manipulate their currency. This is what Donald Trump is talking about when he talks about the Chinese manipulating their currency. So that is a possibility. It could benefit us there, but it would make borrowing costs raise because the dollar is in lower demand, which makes it harder to repay debt. And it also makes it harder to fund domestic programs because we are not able to borrow as much. We wouldn't have the low interest rates that we have now because right now OPEC and all these other nations, China, for example, are buying US bonds, which keeps the interest rates low. If less people are buying, the interest rates go up because we can't risk as much loss. So it makes it harder to fund domestic programs. It can make the economy suffer there. Oil is also more expensive because we no longer have the benefit of the petrodollar recycling. We no longer have money coming in from our own sales and the sales of the rest of the world. It's hard to know if China's petro yuan will ever take off, and it's even harder to know if it could possibly take the place from the dollar as the de facto international reserve currency. It's clear, however, that if that does happen, it would not be good for America, likely, but it would most definitely not be good for the preeminence of America on the global economic stage. And it's also clear that we're on shaky ground as it is. This is Jake Lloyd reporting for Infowars.com.
You know, I've got some talking points here about Caveman from InfoWarsLife.com. But instead of going with those talking points, let me just give you what I've experienced personally. From all the wives' tales in every culture, we know that the bones have the essence. We know chicken noodle soup is great for people that are sick. Again, in every culture, this has been reported because it works. And there's no way to quantify how strong this is, but the amount of bone protein and the amount of marrow and the amount of concentrated life force that is in this is incredible. Ladies and gentlemen, whether it's for your joints, whether it's for your arteries and your veins, whether it's for your brain, whether it's for energy, this, ladies and gentlemen, is the strongest, most concentrated bone broth formula out there, and it's amazing. Find out for yourself today at InfoWarsStore.com what it can do for you and your family. And again, I want to thank you all for your support. You are funding the information war in 2018.